The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome on board the RichPlanet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall, and this week's guest is a scientist who has been looking at evidence for the existence of life on Mars. Since Galileo first developed his telescope in 1608 and was first to observe Mars through it, astronomers have wondered about the possibility of life on the red planet. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get him beamed up onto the ship. It's Anthony Beckett.
Hi Richard, how are you?
Welcome, Anthony.
Thank you.
Are you okay?
Very well, thanks, yeah.
Good. So we're here to talk about Mars
Yes,
and your passion, I guess.
it's become that, yeah.
Now, how did you first get interested in Mars? Because I know you have a scientific background, you've got degrees in chemistry. How did that lead to an interest in Mars?
Well, I've always been following the space programs, and around 2004, I went to a conference and I saw a guy called Richard Hoagland give a presentation about evidence of artificial structures on Mars. And I came home from, this is 2004, 6 years ago, I came home and I just started studying and looking into this thing.
Right.
And what I found with it was there was very compelling evidence that there was something about this data, but I found it was quite difficult information to present to people, so I took it upon myself to start to do that myself, to put together the information in a digestible form that people could relate to.
So it was Hoagland that first got you involved.
Yeah, he got me hooked.
He's certainly a character, isn't he?
He is.
Now, there's been interest in Mars for centuries, hasn't there? And it sort of became more scientific in the 50s. But tell us about telescopes and people's interest in general over the centuries.
The telescope was invented in the 1600s, and it was, we don't really know who invented the telescope. It was invented by a Dutchman, apparently, of all accounts. There's a Dutchman applied for a patent, but it was refused because he hadn't actually invented it, because it had been widely known. The technology worked its way to Italy and to Venice, and Galileo basically started producing them for the market, started selling them. And it was actually in the same year of 1608 that Galileo first reported that he'd actually looked at Mars through the telescope, and that began the first real exploration of Mars. And as the years went by, even Cassini and all the kind of famous astronomers would have looked at Mars, Cassini, Huygens, and it got to towards like the middle of the 18th century. The telescopes were significantly advanced, that you could see kind of more detail. They'd also started using one of Newton's ideas, which is spectroscopy, to work out what the chemical composition of the Mars's atmosphere was. So by the middle of the 19th century, they'd already deduced that it had an atmosphere, that it was similar in some regards to the Earth, and that it possibly contained water vapour. There's debate about the accuracy of the scientific method at that time, so it wasn't, you know, people argued the case. But what happened was in the East, the opposition of 1977, opposition is when the Earth and Mars get to the closest point. It happens approximately every 2 years. And in 1877, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was an astronomer based in Italy, looked at Mars through his telescope, one of his high-powered telescopes at the time, and started detailing lots of the features of
right. And what year are you talking about here?
This is 1877.
1877, and we've got an image there. Is that one of his images?
Yeah, this image is one of his maps. They call them Schiaparelli's maps, and people had drawn diagrams before, but Schiaparelli made a really detailed documentation of what he saw on the planet's surface. And it's basically one of the most noteworthy features is basically these long linear lines that kind of intersect and cross over the planes, the lighter planes. You can see there's actually darker regions and light regions, and these lines intersect over the light regions. Schiaparelli was an Italian. He referred to these as canali, because that's the Italian word which means channel. It was mistranslated into the English word canal,
Right.
And so, which obviously has connotations because it means it's synthetic, somebody's built it, it's not a natural form. And so what you had by the end of the 19th century, you had astronomers such as Percival Lovell, an American businessman and entrepreneur, I guess. He built the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff. It was the first time an observatory had been built dedicated to, well, in a certain location which is had optimum viewing conditions, so you could see more information. And Lovell basically looked at the, he looked through on a telescope at Mars. He saw the same canals as he recalled them, which were actually just channels by Schiaparelli's reckoning. And he basically created a mythology about the existence of Martian beings living on basically this world, and who were using these channels to transport water from the polar regions, which he considered to have water, down to the desert regions, which he considered to be dry. So basically, Percival Lovell created, well, he wasn't the first person to postulate the idea of Martian beings, but he really kind of promoted the idea in the popular culture of the time.
Okay, and what are these channels or these lines? I mean, do we know what they are now?
In fact, we don't really know what they are to this day, because once we got there in the first mission, which is Marion 9, there was no channels canali to be seen.
Okay.
So we're not really sure what they were looking at.
Right.
It's been speculated. Well, there was a scientist from about 1920s whose name I forget, but he speculated that what these channels was actually the radial impact debris fields. So imagine like a meteorite hits, you get radial patterns out. So the what he was saying was that the dark spots between the canals were impact craters. Obviously, from Earth-based telescopes in the 19th century, they're not going to see that detail. Right. But we never really worked it out because the coloration of the surface seems to have been different when we got there in the 60s and
we'll
70s.
come on to colours later on in the programme.
Yeah.
Now, you know, as the 1950s approached, we entered the space race, and serious scientists started thinking there could be life on this planet. So I believe there are certain institutes which sort of considered the possibility that there might be intelligent life even on Mars.
Well, yeah, well, NASA itself commissioned the Brookings Institute to look into it. It actually commissioned it to look into the peaceful, it's a study into the peaceful space exploration. But part of that was basically trying to consider what would happen if we discovered such things as intelligent beings outside of the solar system and outside of planet Earth. Sorry. The
Brookings Institute, was this sort of philosophers of the day, or what sort of people were involved in that?
Well, it was a think tank. It's basically a Washington DC based think tank that was basically, they'll do commissions, they'll do reports into all sorts of different things. And basically, NASA was founded in about 1958 or 59. At the same time, it's around the same year NASA commissioned this report because, okay, they knew the Soviets had got some man in orbit. The Sputnik had been the first artificial satellite, and the Americans were a little bit far behind. So they needed to really get their act together to get on target in the space race. So the Brookings report was basically them giving them an overview of how they would proceed and conduct their space activities peacefully.
So they weren't really a technical body. They were more of like looking at the morality of it and the impact on humanity.
Oh, yeah, and the economic impact as well.
Yeah, and I believe we've got a quote here from the Brookings Institute, Anthony.
Yeah, I'll just read this short section out. It goes, though intelligent or semi-intelligent life conceivably exists elsewhere in the solar system, if intelligent extraterrestrial life is discovered in the next 20 years, it will very probably be by radio telescope from other solar systems. However, evidence of its existence might also be found in artifacts left on the moon or other planets. So what NASA's the think tank came up with the conclusion was that if extraterrestrial life exists and it's out there, then we might start seeing the remnants of that when we start exploring into the solar system. And that was the whole reason for NASA commissioning it. The report itself covered all sorts of things like the advances in weather forecasting technology, so they could see they knew that they could actually work out to see. Back in the days, they had like a few hours warning for a hurricane coming over Florida, for example. It gave them the opportunity to realize that they could develop weather systems and things, all sorts of different things. But this was only minor. So this part about the intelligent life was only a minor part of the report, but it might be a significant one.
Right. Well, we'll come on to the possibility of ruins and other such things later on. But I've got a list here, Anthony, which is I didn't realise there's been so many probes actually gone to Mars or attempted to go to Mars. I mean, you've got a list here which goes right back to 1960, And it's interesting that the first sort of 5 missions were all Russian up to 1962, and every single one of them failed. And then we've got Mariner 3, which was the first US one, which failed. And then the first successful one was Mariner 4 in 1964, and that returned just 21 images.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a flyby. The Mariner 4 mission was a flyby. It didn't go into orbit, and it only took a limited number of pictures. So the 21 images was simply because it was it was passing Mars, and it just shot the video cameras to see what it could see. And to be frank, it kind of was kind of disappointing, because prior to that mission, it was widely, even scientists seriously considered that there might well be, like, higher forms of life on Mars, such as trees and things. And in the early days of NASA, they were actually considering how they would actually detect life on other planets and this kind of thing. And they actually considered that when looking for life on Mars, they might even see evidence of plant life in videos shot of the planet. Unfortunately, Mariner was, being of the day and the technology of the day, it was black and white video. It wasn't very high resolution. It basically wasn't going to show evidence of life. But the disappointing part of this was that it showed evidence of heavy cratering on Mars, which basically made the planet look very much more like the Moon, which we know to be lifeless.
Right.
So it was disappointing in that respect, because it dashed the hopes of many who thought there might be life on Mars.
Right, with just 21 images.
Yeah.
And if we look, I mean, there's more than 40 probes actually gone to Mars over the years, and they're nearly all either American or Russian. And out of the 40 odd, there's only 17, give or take 1 or 2. I've just done an estimate here, 17 out of 41. So way more than half of the missions have actually failed that have gone to Mars. And the only other nations other than Russia and the US there was one in Japan, from Japan, 1998, which again failed. And then there was the famous Beagle 2, which was a European effort, which also failed.
Yeah, the Beagle 2 was shipped to, even though it was the European Space Agency mission, it relied heavily on NASA still. So I think the Mars Express was the European Space Agency orbiter that carried Beagle 2. But they relied heavily on NASA for things like telemetry.
Right. So it's the European part of it which built the craft which went to Mars, and Beagle was like piggybacked on it. Is that right?
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
And then did this craft enter orbit? The Mars Express, it entered orbit.
Express went into orbit, and I think it's still there, and I think it's still active actually.
Right. So that was a success then. But the Beagle, which was part of it, which was to go down onto the surface.
It was supposed to be a lander to land on the surface and gather. In fact, it was. They've been to Mars. There's been a previous mission to Mars looking for life, but the Beagle 2 experiment had experiments on it that were suitably tailored towards basically proving once and for all whether there is life on the surface. Actually, we'll get onto the Viking missions later.
We'll come on to that.
But unfortunately, like you're alluding to, the mission it was a failure, and it didn't succeed. The claim was that the parachute deployment didn't work successfully or something, or didn't work adequately. There was actually speculation at the time from scientists involved that they misjudged the atmospheric conditions, which is why they basically didn't managed to get the probe down. And there was some criticism of NASA in that regard, because they obviously maybe didn't help as much as they could do, having had their own successes in the past.
Right, so NASA perhaps didn't give them all of the information about the atmosphere or what have you. I felt pretty sorry for Colin Pillinger at the time. I remember he took a lot of stick. I mean, it is interesting that Russia and America are really the only two that have got anywhere near.
Yeah.
And there is theories that the two have colluded. I know there was the Cold War, but a lot of people say that they were colluding behind closed doors during the Cold War. And perhaps, here comes Europe, who's going to say, right, there's life on Mars.
Oh, right, you're saying, because you're saying there's a third entity coming in.
It's a third entity coming in that maybe, we don't want them to discover what's down there. I'm not saying that's what happened, but it's, the thing didn't actually get to Mars, and as soon as it's got released from its parent craft, they couldn't communicate with it, could they?
So if you look at the successes and failures in the past, it's unlikely to get a success every time. So, but there's a significant number of failures, as you've mentioned. I think, from memory, I think there's proportionally more failures for missions to Mars than for any other planet. But then that might well be because of when they went there in the first place, it was early days of the space program, and therefore there were more failures. Or it may be that there's something else to do with Mars, and to do with exploring Mars is it's more inherently difficult to do. Yeah. Even though it's such a close planet to Earth.
Yeah. And there was one in 1973 which Russia launched, which missed the planet and is now in orbit around the sun.
I'm sure there are several of those.
And then this other one here, which was 1992, a US one, failure lost prior to Mars arrival.
That's the Mars Observer spacecraft.
Yes.
Yeah, that was. Well, the official explanation was they simply lost the telemetry. Somebody accidentally unplugged the telemetry on a $1 billion spacecraft.
Yeah, they just suddenly lost communication.
Yeah. It's interesting because we'll go into this later, but the evidence for artificiality and artificial ruins, and like I mentioned earlier, Mars from Richard Hoagland came from images brought back from Viking, which is from like 20 years before then. And so what we actually had at the time was people lobbying Congress in the US to set mission priorities for Mars Observer, and they were basically slated. And one guy wrote a report, a peer review, which really criticised them heavily. 3 days after his report was published, the probe was missing, lost.
This is when they lost the probe.
And that was 3 days before it was due to be inserted into orbit.
Okay, and that was so after this scientist had said we should be looking for ruins on Mars.
Yeah, that was Professor Stanley McDaniel did a peer review of Richard Hoagland's and other researchers' work.
Yeah. 3 days later, the telemetry stops working. Right.
One of those things.
Yeah. Okay, then, Anthony. Well, we're going to talk about the colours after the break because there's some very suspicious data with regards to that, and also possible ruins on Mars. But we'll come back after this short break.
The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories. The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome back on board the Starship, and we're talking with Anthony Beckett, who is looking for life on Mars. And in the mid-1970s, there was two very interesting probes landed on Mars, wasn't there, Anthony? They were the Viking mission. Tell us about that. They were two identical craft, am I right?
The two virtually identical landers basically dropped onto the Martian surface. It was the first time that obviously they got to the surface of Mars. They sent probes beforehand. Mariner 9 a few years earlier, I think 1969, got into orbit around Mars and stayed there for a few years. But it wasn't until the Viking missions in '75 which they actually planned to get two landers onto the surface. And we have this image to show, which shows the NASA scientist and famous astronomer called Carl Sagan stood next to what is a mock-up of what the Viking lander looks like. So you get an idea of scale there.
And these things couldn't roam around the surface, they were just in a fixed location.
Yeah, it was a static lander.
So they chose two locations of interest, which then sent back data.
So they sent there to look for geological information, but also it had a biology mission as well. He had like a biology experiments aboard. So when that probe was put down in situ on the planet, they had to they just had to hope that they'd land it somewhere where they could take reasonable samples that were representative. So should we move on to the next slide?
Yeah. So this is another one from the surface. Yeah, this is the first image to be beamed back from, I forget which one of the two landers, I'm sure it must be Viking 1 considering. But the first image to be beamed back was, this image, and it shows what is unusual for what we'd consider to be an image of planet Mars, because if you browse around the NASA website, you'll see another idea of Mars. But in this first image, what you see is kind of a light, whitish, pale, kind of a pinkish hue to the sky, and brownish rocks, and obviously the lander. Nothing much there. It looks very barren, very desert-like. But later on in the mission and the day as well, as it happens, we go on to the image. We see more images like this, which shows Mars with a clear blue, bright blue in this case, sky. It's kind of interesting because if you read a magazine or newspaper articles about Mars, and it's a red planet. We don't know it's we know of it as the red planet. And we make an assumption, and that it has a red sky, but maybe that's not quite true. And it wasn't a one-off because most of the photographs from Viking showed Mars with a blue sky. And there are exceptions. There's a really a nice image of a sunset which basically looks red, but we'll get red sunsets on Earth, so that's nothing special. And having a blue sky on Mars isn't unusual because the whole physics of why you have a blue sky on Earth is it's to do with the process called Rayleigh scattering. It's about the kind of scattering of blue light predominantly over red light. And because of the chemical makeup of the Martian atmosphere, being predominantly 95+% carbon dioxide, albeit at like less than 1% of the Earth's atmospheric pressure, we should still see the same physics in action. We should still see a blue sky on Mars. And, 1970s we did. Okay. Now, in later probes, we seem to have the colour of the sky changes through 97 and 2004. Tell us about this.
Yeah, well, in later missions, we've mentioned Mars Observer, which was 1993. It was supposed to be going out in orbit, I think it was, but that obviously failed. It was another 3-4 years later. It was 1997 when the Mars Pathfinder mission finally got to Mars again.
Right, this was a successful one.
Yeah, and we've got this next image which shows you an example of a couple of images from the Viking at the top. The middle two images are from the NASA Pathfinder mission, which show a kind of, they're representative of what you'd see if you browse the websites for the mission images. And you see kind of a brownish red sky on the Pathfinder mission ones. Then you come to 2004 with the Mars Exploration Rover mission, which had the two rovers, which we'll speak about later, roaming around. Now this show more a brownish but also deeper red sky, and also in some of the images we see a very deep red terrain as well. So what we've seen here is over the period of what is 30 years, we're seeing the change in the Martian sky from blue through to a deeper red.
And you would contend that NASA have basically doctored those images for some particular reason?
I can prove they've doctored the images.
You can prove they've doctored the images?
What I can't prove is the intent behind that. But
the intent behind it, okay. Now, you showed me a very interesting image earlier, which was the, is it the sundial?
Yeah, this is a panoramic image from one of the landing pads. I think it's one before Spirit rolled off the landing pad.
Yeah.
And you see in the centre at the bottom, you see something called, it looks like a bit of a computer joystick.
Yeah.
It's a colour calibration target. And in this image here, we've seen like it's zoomed in, it's close, it's zoomed in on it. Well, you'll see...
It looks like an old Atari joystick,
it doesn't it?
Remember
them? So you see on the corners of the joystick,
yeah.
They call it the sundial, and it basically shows the angle of the sun, and it's also got like grayscale images which show the intensity, the light intensity, and also on the corners, it has 4 different colours. It's got red, green, blue, and probably yellow. I can't remember.
Yellow or green it'll be. Won't it?
Yeah. Oh yeah. And so, but what we've got on this one is the the bottom right corner is bright red, really radiant red. And the other 3 corners are quite equal in tone and colour, look brown. The bottom left is kind of dark brown, but the top 2 are identical browns. And it's like, well, okay, the calibration target was designed for a reason. It's called a calibration target for a reason. It's used, or it's intended to be used, so you can calibrate the images properly, so you can see what the lighting characteristics are like on that image. So this image is clearly uncalibrated. No one has gone out of the way to actually calibrate the image.
So let's have a look at that. That is an actual picture of the object from on Earth.
Yeah, this is like a lab technician holding the display. So you'll see that the bottom right image, the bottom right colour target is blue.
Blue.
And the top left one is green.
Right.
But if you remember back at the original image, it wasn't showing green. It was showing green as brown. People have argued that the reason the blue comes up as bright red is because the Mars really has a red atmosphere, and red light comes down, so predominantly everything's bathed in a red light. Well, all you need is GCSE. You don't have to pass your GCSE physics to know that when a blue object absorbs light and it emits blue light, a blue object that absorbs that only is bathed in red light will never emit red light.
No.
It can only emit blue light. That's its characteristic.
Yes.
So that proves that the image is not uncalibrated. It's not to do with ambient red light.
It might be darker because there's lack of light, but it's not going to be bright red, is it?
No, exactly. That's it. See, that proves that the image is uncalibrated.
Yeah.
The problem is that NASA have in the press releases put out these images as being the true colour images of Mars. Some images say the false colour, and occasionally what they will do is, in this particular slide here, it says not the true colours of Mars. What it's showing is an explanation from NASA about what they do, and they basically say they take the green and the blue channels. Each of the eyes and cameras record 4 different wavelengths. Red, green, blue, and then infrared. So what they actually do is take the green and take the blue, but rather than showing red as red, they show infrared and then render it in image as red. So they're actually showing a supersaturated red image. There's technical reasons why they will want to do that. You see more information about the kind of mineralogy and geology basically by doing that. So it's just scientific or technical reasons for wanting to do it.
Yes.
But at the same time, these images are being peddled as the real true colour of Mars, which they are clearly not.
So they're doctoring images, basically, of Mars?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. and it's anyone's guess as to why they don't want people to think that Mars has got a blue sky and it looks very similar to Arizona or somewhere like that.
It's kind of interesting because if you go back to the original Viking missions in the 70s, which had blue sky, if you look at the actual images as they are on like the Jet Propulsion Laboratory's website, which is NASA, part of NASA, it seems they're showing slightly different tints in the original images. So I've got a few examples of the poorly calibrated Viking images where they seem to have gone out the way to make these images redder, which were originally blue sky. So much so that the one that I've shown on the left shows the American flag, but rather than it being red, white and blue, it's red, white and purple. There's two. They've gone a bit overboard with the kind of saturation of the red there. Yeah. Well, at the same time, just prior to the Mars Exploration Rover program, which started in 2004, I think the landers landed in January of 2004. There was a press conference. I think it must have been the year earlier, I'm sure. But, I don't actually know the exact date.
So these were identical landers, weren't they? And
they were identical
landers. These ones could move around the surface as well.
Right.
So this is 2004.
In fact, in this image, you can see a mock-up of one of the landers on the desk next to the press conference table. So you see the solar cells at the back, and you see the head with looks like the little robot from Short Circuit, the eyes. And that's basically a small mock-up of what they look like. Well, at this particular press conference, they showed a big picture behind the press conference, behind the scenes, showing an image of Mars. I think it's from the Pathfinder mission, but it showed Mars with a blue sky.
Right.
So still, back in the mid-90s,
Pathfinder 96.
We have an image of Mars with the blue sky. So why are they showing all these images? Why in the newspapers and books does it say Mars is red?
So maybe that image there, that conference, was an undoctored NASA image, perhaps, maybe, that the scientists have access to.
Undoctored is a bit strong. It might be just that it's well calibrated.
All right.
But I'm kind of nice on them sometimes. I'll give them the benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
But,
right.
But of course, there may be a reason why they would want to suppress certain colours on the surface of Mars.
We can come on to that.
Yeah.
Now, the 1976 probe, which was the Viking, that's the only mission that intended to try and find out life. Is that right?
It's correct in one sense. I call it the first and last exobiology expedition, simply the fact that it had biology experiments on board which were designed to detect microbes actually in the soil.
Right. So how do they define that, and how do they say, well, this is life or this isn't life? What's the experiment that they use to say that there's life there?
In fact, that was one of the dilemmas of the scientists from the 60s up, from. I think NASA gave its first contract to somebody to investigate just that problem. It's a guy called Wolf Fishnack. I don't know whereabouts he was from. He was working from some university in the US, and he was tasked with looking into that exact problem. And he came to the conclusion that a lot of scientists were thinking that you send a probe to Mars. If there's such things as plant life, you can take pictures of it. But even on Earth, you don't get plants everywhere, but you tend to get microbes everywhere. They're kind of ubiquitous on the planet Earth. So the assumption was that microbes would likely, similarly, be ubiquitous on Mars. So they focused on just looking for microbes, and then they have the problem of, well, does it still use the same chemistry as you find on Earth? Or does it? So is it carbon-based? Is it carbon-based? Does it need water? I mean, they had to basically made assumptions based on the knowledge of terrestrial life. And there's ideas obviously that you can have silicon-based life, but even within the carbon-based life system, you can have, you can have like what we now know as extremophiles that live and breathe and feed on, various different chemicals and use different chemical processes that wouldn't be we don't find everywhere else. And it was interesting because back in the 70s when this mission was developed, they didn't know about extremophiles. They were discovered in the late 70s when the hydrothermal vents were discovered. Right. And stuff. So when Viking went to Mars, they were looking for regular microbes, not what we'd consider extremophiles. So,
and what did it find? What was their conclusions from that?
Well, of the three experiments that finally went, the one was called label release experiment, one was a pyrolytic release, and one was the gas exchange experiment. All were designed to elicit a kind of response from. Take a sample of soil. Two of them fed a nutrient solution to the soil in the hope that if there was any microbes, they would feed on the solution and then produce a gas which could then be measured. And the gas exchange experiment was basically designed to see if there were any gases given off, which would be indicative of life. One of the problems being that there's so many ways you can look for evidence of biochemical actions. There's a lot of chemicals you can look for, which basically are both biological and other mineral processes for its creation. So they had to design an experiment which basically looked for how a chemical process would make something. And the general idea is that chemistry happens faster than biology. So the time frame for a response was critical. Well, anyway, in the criteria they set the criteria which basically meant they had a positive, anyway, one story short, because we're running out of time, they had a positive response for the label release experiment. It gave a positive signal for showing life, and the control showed, which is what they expected, nothing there. The pyrolytic release showed a similar example of a positive result, and the gas exchange just didn't respond to anything, didn't seem to detect anything. That basically, in their own criteria, said, look, well, yeah, we found life on Mars, we found evidence for microbes on Mars.
So there was evidence for microbes?
Yeah, they were concerned because the response wasn't as fast as they once, the hopes. So it was kind of what you'd expect to get from a result, say, from the pyrolytic release experiment from a sample of soil from Antarctica.
Right.
And so it was actually in the right ballpark, but the questions arose because it seemed to be that was actually both chemistry and biology happening. So some of the response was to do with chemistry. Right. And some with biology. Also, what they found from the response was that it died off, it tailed off too quickly than what they expected. But as has happened in recent years, people have shown that the reason, well, if you consider extremophiles, you can kill extremophiles by just giving them the same kind of nutrients that would kind of other microbes live off. So it's very likely the reason the positive response tailed off at the end was because they're not terrestrial microbes. It's not life like we know it, and we just killed them by giving them the wrong kind of foods. But what we did get was a positive signal of life, which to their own criteria was basically test positive for life on Mars. Right. It was challenged from another angle as well, because a gas chromatograph, which was there to detect organic molecules in the atmosphere, didn't do that. Didn't do its job. It didn't detect didn't detect organics in the atmosphere. Well, the same device didn't detect organics on Antarctica. Right. And it was always argued, the case was always argued that the sensitivity of the GCMS wasn't nowhere near the levels what you get from the pyrolytic release and the label release experiment. So you could never disprove a positive of the other two experiments with that. Right. But that's exactly what they did. They used the GCMS results to wipe their hands clean of a discovery of life on Mars. So would you say that the results were inconclusive then? Is that in summary? I would say they were conclusive. They were conclusive, which was that there is test positive for microbial life on Mars. Microbial life on Mars. I'm not the only one to think that. There's many kind of astronomers who this guy called David Darling wrote a really good book actually, whose the title I forget, but he's been outspoken about this one. Quite a few people have been as well. Okay, so in other words, NASA are interpreting those results differently to what some scientists are. Is that what? Yeah, it's been claimed that basically what's happened is, we mentioned the Brookings Institute report before. One thing that actually stated is that if they did find evidence of albeit intelligent life, they would not necessarily release it to the public. And I think what we have here is a case where they discovered not intelligent life but just life, and it was such a big paradigm shift for the people. They were either too scared to go ahead with releasing it and acknowledging it, or maybe there's another reason behind it, but for some reason they decided to keep it behind closed doors. Right. Now, after that point, after the mid-70s, none of the other missions specifically searched for microbial life. They just knocked it on the head for whatever reason. Yeah. But there was one probe which had a microscope analysing some of the ground. Yeah. And which wasn't specifically looking for life, but it's a very interesting image. It was looking. The other missions, I say that Viking was the first and last exobiology expedition, but the other missions have been set to look for things that would be conducive to life. So they have been looking for evidence of the potential life, but never direct evidence for life. But what they found, like what you're referring to with the Phoenix lander, is quite intriguing. What year was that one? This was in 2007. I think the images we're going to show was from 2009. Right, from the Phoenix Mars lander. This is a very recent one. There's a researcher called Ron Bennett, who he took the original frames from NASA, the initial images came from the microscope, which is basically looking at soil samples, and put the red, green and the blue channels all back together because they were in separate images, and put that into a sequence and looped it. And what it showed was a very intriguing evidence of things that moved beneath under the microscope of Mars Phoenix lander. Right. So, and there's contention over whether that's actually life moving around or whether it's
just been blown around? I mean,
well, contention isn't there. In a sense, NASA haven't been looking at it. NASA haven't officially or openly discussed it. Ron Bennett is the only person I'm aware of who has actually done this work.
Right.
But what he's showing is we'll show the image in a second. But what he's showing is evidence for things moving on the surface under the microscope. Well, you can interpret that how you like. Just see the image for yourself. See what you think.
Am I right in thinking that Arthur C. Clarke claimed that there were trees on Mars?
Yeah, Arthur C. Clarke was the science fiction writer, was convinced until the day he died that the images returned from Mars Global Surveyor in 1999 of a region around the South Pole of Mars showed structures which were he believed they were trees. They were a Martian plant life. It's interesting because up until recently, NASA hadn't been looking at them, hadn't acknowledged. Well, they've not looked at them at all in the context that there might be biology. They call them they've returned to. I think no, it's actually the Mars Express. I think high-rise camera returned to Mars and took more recent photographs in high res of the same objects which we're going to show. And well, they basically NASA claim that there's no objects like this on Earth, so they're completely unique to Mars. Well, I beg to differ because you see things like this all the time. They're called trees. It doesn't prove they are trees. It means they look like trees. They have the dendritic patterns of things branching out, which you kind of get from watercourses as well. It's not they're not unique to just biology. But what the point here is that NASA haven't dealt with the evidence as evidence for potential trees, despite back in the 50s saying that's one of the things they would look for.
Right. So it could just be minerals or something like that, but then again, you think it could be...
It could be minerals, but...
Something similar to a tree, you think it could be?
Yeah, it could be minerals, but then at the same time, one of these objects is actually 500 metres across. And, okay, that seems quite big for a tree, but just thinking like redwoods or something. But there's actually trees on Earth that grow to that size and are more of comparable dimensions as well. There's the banyan trees that kind of... well, there's one in...
Or it could be a coral. Like a reef or something like that.
Yeah, it's a mineral still, but it's obviously biological origin.
Right.
So yeah, another angle. So yeah, the point is that NASA haven't looked at it as evidence for biological life.
Okay then, Anthony, well, we're coming up to a break now, and after the break we were going to talk about evidence of intelligent life on Mars.
The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories. The RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome back on board the Starship, and we're talking with Anthony Beckett, who has been searching for evidence of life on Mars. And one of the most famous areas on Mars, Anthony, is Cydonia, and I think a lot of people who are interested in astronomy have heard of Cydonia, because there appears to be lots of strange, perhaps man-made, we might say, objects in this area. Certainly looks, you know, I think there's something to it, but give us the history of it, Anthony.
Well, basically, yeah, Cydonia was a region first photographed by the Mars Viking orbiter, like number 1. After it dropped its orbiter off into the surface to go, to do its experiments, it would continue to go around the planet to map the planet and also look for a suitable landing site for the second lander. And one of the images it sent back was basically an image which basically showed what looked like a human face staring up from the surface. Now, it's not just me who thinks that, it's not just yourself who thinks that. NASA employees in the press conference say, oh yeah, it looks like a Martian face. It looks like a face on the Martian surface. They also clarified that, saying, well, it's just tricks of light and shadow, because when we went back, it just disappeared. It's just an illusion. Because, you see faces in clouds, you see faces everywhere, The idea, well, even really, think about a photograph. A face in a photograph is an illusion. It's not really a human face. It's a representation of such. The question was, here we have what looks like a face on Mars. Looking up at the camera, is that evidence of? Is it just chance, or is it somebody built it? One of the things we mentioned, Brookings, earlier about the possibility of finding artifacts on the Moon or other planets. Well, is this what we're looking at? Something to investigate.
Okay. Now, there's also the five-sided pyramid, which is another artifact nearby, not far. I mean, have you got a diagram there, Anthony?
We do. Yeah, we have this. This is what's called the DNM pyramid. To tell you the story about how the D&M pyramid was discovered briefly, well, I mentioned that NASA claimed that the first image just as it was trickle light and shadow. Well, and it's two engineers called Dimitri and Molinar. They were two electrical engineers, and what they were trying to do was find the second image that NASA had referred to when they said it was just trickle light and shadow. They couldn't find the image, and it'd been lost from the archive somewhere. They eventually found it. It was misfiled and places, so eventually got hold of it. And once they had, well, basically what it proved was that NASA was basically lied. It wasn't just a trick of light and shadow. Because when with a different sun angle, it still looked like a human face. So rather than it being an object which, when you look from one angle, looks like a face, but you turn it, you lose the image, the illusion. You have a constant illusion of a face. Now, that doesn't prove it's artificial. It proves it just looks like a face. That's all you've proven. But these engineers were interested in eliciting more information out. So they needed the two images of the face to do that. But in the second image, it had another object, which they found to be of more interest eventually. And that was the D&M pyramid. It's named after them two engineers. The reason being possibly obvious reasons. You can see the obvious symmetry, bilateral symmetry in the image. It also looks like a five-pointed star. Not quite. It doesn't have it doesn't have rotational symmetry because it's you've got like the top half actually. What the image shows and the graphic shows is that the top half represents hexagonal symmetry, while the bottom half shows pentagonal symmetry. So you have like geometry going on in there, which is kind of odd for a natural feature.
And how would that compare to the size of a pyramid on Earth? I mean,
lengthwise, I think it's about it's a mile to a mile and a half long or something like that.
All right, so it would be much bigger then.
Yeah, but at the same time, it's not tall; it's very shallow.
Okay. Yeah.
They call it the D&M pyramid, but it's more like a barrow or an earthworks than it is than an actual pyramid. Right. You know, pyramids. You know, you think Egyptian Giza pyramid, nothing like that. If this is a landform that is being carved to look like a five-sided pyramid, well, a five-sided earthworks, Marsworks. The question is, who carved it? Was it weather? Was it kind of the environment, or was it intelligent life?
Right. Well, one of the theories on Earth which comes from Robert Bauval about the Giza pyramids, is that they represent the stars in Orion's belt.
Yes, yeah.
And there are other researchers, such as I spoke to the historian Alan Wilson, who believes that the mounds in Wales, the ancient mounds, he believes that they map to the stars. They are laid out in known constellations.
Yeah.
And we've got a video clip here of a YouTube clip of a chap who basically takes all of the anomalies in Cydonia and then he overlays them on a specific star map called the Pleiades, which is a constellation that we know about. And he compares them. So we're just going to take a look at that clip now.
This is the area of Cydonia on Mars. There's the Mars face, the five-sided pyramid, and the grouping of ruins which we call a cluster that we believe matches the Pleiades stars. Now what I've done here is I've taken a transparency simply by going over all the detail on this photograph and marking circles over all the anomalies, even the small ones, the Mars face. This area here, you'll see those little bits and pieces. Just have a relook at it again. That is what the transparency looks like. We have the Mars face targeted. That's the most important part. The other detail here we're going to see on the star map what is special about that position. So let's take this transparency, which you know is an exact match with Mars. We're going to look at the area of Taurus. And to find the Pleiades in the night sky, you go to Orion and follow the three belt stars through Taurus, and you find the Pleiades. It's a common astronomical little trick that the ancients knew very well about, and they've shown Orion also finding the way through to something special in Taurus. Let's zoom in now on the Pleiades. Here's our transparency now. We put the transparency over it, and you'll see why this theory is so exciting. It's actually an amazing duplicate of the stars. I don't know if the camera can pick it up clearly, but here is our Mars face area. Can I tilt it? Is it alright? It's alright, okay. All these stars fit by magnitude with basically the size of the anomalies. Even some of the other stars in contention here have anomalies matching. There's a grouping down here that seems to match that other grouping on Mars. But more importantly, let's see what star comes into the position of the target. Now we know that that target is directly in place. I'll take the transparency away. We'll now zoom in this area. So let's look at the target area. under magnification, I'm going to lock in on this star and run back in time. Now, we need to find what star is in this area as we go back into time. I'm going to run back in hundreds of years per second, starting now. Watch the small star. There it goes. Running back now, 1,000 years ago. That's 0 BC. Now we're going back to 3,000 years ago. It's over here. 4,000 years ago. 5,000 years ago. So it's 4, 5, 6,000 years ago. It's in that position. It's moved from there in the exact direction that we're anticipating. What's so important about this little star? This is our sun-like star that we're looking at, and it's 16 light years away, 15.74 to be exact. And this amount of time needed to get to exactly being in position is 17,000 years ago. In 17,000 years, it gets exactly into that position. That matches the Mars face. That is our conclusion. 17,000 years ago, that area on Mars was very, very important, and it seems to revere a sun-like star being a place of the gods, a place of humans colonizing this place on Mars. And this is more than likely in reverence of the colonization from that star.
Right, so what he's claiming there is that there's a star which 17,000 years ago was in the position where the face on Mars was, and therefore he believes that whoever built those structures built them to revere whatever that star was. So therefore he's dated that the thing to 17,000 years old.
Because that's exactly what Robert Val and his colleagues did for Giza, didn't they?
Yeah.
They managed to wind back the celestial clock to map. I think it was worked out to be about 10,000 BC. I think when the ground plan matched. I think Sirius, like that particular star, over time moved significantly. That's fascinating. That's really good corroboration.
Yeah, I mean, I'd like to independently see that done by somebody else to get all of those anomalies at Cydonia and compare them with the Pleiades. There's an interesting thing about the Pleiades, of course, is that a lot of people who claim to have had contact with extraterrestrials, contactees we call them, people like Billy Myers and many others, claim that they come from the Pleiades.
I have heard that. I have heard that. Yeah.
And they're generally the human type extraterrestrials. This is what these people tell us. So it is fascinating
that in itself is fascinating. Yeah. I've got a quick thing on that. It's Billy Mayer, the guy who there's a CIA analyst who authenticated one of the Billy Mayer photographs, at least one of them. And interesting enough, this guy was called Michael Merlin, a CIA analyst. Now that guy went on to have complete control of all of these images coming back from NASA. That's just a coincidence. You just mentioned this now. That guy has complete control. That begs the question.
So there's a CIA guy has control of NASA's images of Cydonia.
Well, former CIA guy. He founded his own company. He's an image analysis expert. He found Michael Merlin Merlin Space Science Systems.
Right.
If you go to msss.com, you'll see all most of the images from the 1990 Pathfinder onto only a few years ago. But yeah, the same guy was responsible for sharing this information with the world. Obviously, with a time delay, about 6 months recently. But he was also involved in authenticating
Billy Meyer.
A Billy Meyer photograph. How's that work?
Yeah.
You have to wonder, like, who's these photographs which are coming through from NASA. We have this. I've just mentioned there was a time when they were released straight away. Then they went through a period of having a 6-month delay. Makes you wonder if there's anything they can do in the that time frame.
For those who aren't
fake these, I'm just suggesting.
Yes. For those who aren't informed on Billy Meyer is a 70-odd-year-old. Is he Swedish?
Swiss, wasn't he?
Sorry, Swiss guy who claims to have had contact with Pleiadian extraterrestrials going back to the 1950s, and a lot of his early, testimony and evidence is very compelling. Although a lot of people think that he's faked some of it, but the CIA were allegedly keeping tabs on him.
I don't know if he's keeping tabs. From my understanding, this information came from Richard Hoagland. I think the idea was, it was an image analyst. He just looked at the photograph and said, yeah, it wasn't a faked photograph. Didn't come to any kind of conclusion about why it was the objects, the Pleiadian beam ships, as Billy Meyer called them, was there. But it gave some authenticity to it, and I'm just wondering if there's not a bit of deception in that. Maybe And it's just worrying that you have like private contractors handling all these. You know, it's understandable why they use private contractors, but one of the problems has been going back to Mars. One of the problems has been when people have been trying to get accountability of NASA for these images and do more work. NASA just wiped their hands on it in a sense because they don't have legal rights over the images. They owned the property of Michael Malin. Not anymore because I think another company's taken over. It's kind of interesting because when Michael Malin lost the contract for you know, the monopoly basically for being the conduit for the images, he had a press conference which announced that his team had discovered the evidence for water on Mars in the form of the streaks come down the hillside, and it's okay, that's fascinating, but Richard Hoagland and his contemporaries had been talking about them for years, and it took until Michael Malin lost his contract for him to come out and have a press conference and announce it.
Right, and
that's fascinating.
I mean, some of these, the later probes, we've got 26 terabits of data coming back from them, and huge amounts of, the early probes sent back, what was it, 21 images, and now we've got terabytes coming back. So those images of Cydonia, can we not get much more high definition images to prove or disprove that they are natural or not?
We have had more recent high resolution photographs of the face, and what that shows is that it looks less like a face. It looks more like a hill.
Face.
Yeah, it still seems to have very slight symmetry, and the most notable feature is that it looks like it's got water runoff channels. It looks like it's got forms of weathering on there, which is evidence of water. But what people have gone on to do is actually take what looks less like a face, take the two halves of the face image, and then mirror them, which basically gives an illusion again, because it's an illusion of a hominid human face and also a feline face. So there are people speculating that if the face was artificial, it was possibly done in the image of a hominid feline representation, which we know as a sphinx from Egypt. So that connection's been made, but it doesn't prove that the face is artificial. The most compelling stuff to me about the artificiality of Cydonia is the geometry.
Yeah.
It's the repeating angles
I agree.
within the complex.
I'm not sold on the face, but just when you look at that plan view.
Yeah, this is from Richard Hoagland's Enterprise Mission website, and it basically has repeating angle 19.5 degrees, repeating out throughout the complex. The D&M pyramid has got the same angle repeating. It's got all sorts of the mathematical constants going to be deduced from it. It's got its own symmetry, and it's all kind of the pentagonal, hexagonal symmetry. To me, that is compelling. 95% it's artificial, 5%. Well, we still need to prove it. It's not proving anything. But what you've just demonstrated there, you've shown me the clip of this guy who's done some kind of collaboration and taken a part of this complex and extended it to. It's done the same kind of thing that people have done on terrestrial archaeology, but he's done it on extraterrestrial potential archaeology. So at what point? The question is, at what point do you accept it as it being a evidence of intelligence?
And there are a few other than Cydonia, there are other areas on Mars where strange photographs have been taken by NASA. In particular, there's it's known as the Bigfoot image.
Oh yeah, that was the famous headlines in newspapers about the kind of.
It does look very human-like.
It's got the right pose. It does. But it's one of the problem with the image, and it's not. It kind of looks like a person or a statue or something.
Yeah,
stood there.
statue.
But from my analysis, me personally looking at that, and I have no way of knowing anything to do with that. So to me, I don't see that as evidence for life on Mars at all. It's fascinating because if there was, then yeah, it's interesting, but it doesn't prove it. It can't prove it. It isn't capable of proving the argument to me.
Yeah.
But that makes me wonder why it was pushed so heavily in the media as well.
Well, you see, I think the actual image that appeared on was a massive landscape, wasn't it?
Yeah,
and if you look at the whole landscape, you can't actually see it. You have to zoom right into it.
It's right in the bottom left-hand corner.
Right in the bottom corner.
Yeah.
So maybe, I'm only theorising here, maybe NASA let that image go out, not realising that there was a human-like artefact in it, and it slipped through the net. Well, maybe there are thousands of other images that have got statues on them, but they always filter them out.
Yeah.
And that one slipped through because the image was so far in the corner.
It's possible, but why I'm interested is about proving this stuff. And to me, it's potential evidence. It's not evidence enough. You need to look at Carl Sagan in his book Cosmos. It kind of pinned it down. Basically said the first sign of intelligent life on Earth lies in the geometric regularity of its constructions. If we apply that same criteria to extraterrestrial archaeology, We are looking for geometry, and it's the only thing that you can consider a scientific method for proving, or at least, you know, to a degree, to a theory of whether you have intelligent life somewhere, other than obviously meeting people and whatever else. Obviously, if you go visit the place, it's different. But we haven't done that. We've sent probes, we've sent robotic probes, and to me, because of the way the Bigfoot image has been peddled in the media, I'm skeptical. It seems more like a distraction to me.
In the Cydonia, it could be maybe even hundreds of thousands of years old. After, you know, that could have been constructed a long time ago, which is why it's become weathered.
Well, there's a guy called Andrew. I think pronounced his surname Basaggio.
Yes, Basaggio.
Yeah.
I am aware of him. Yeah.
And he on the basis of this image being discovered, which I think was in 2007, been taken, by the Spirit. He wrote a paper which he called "Discovery of Life on Mars," and it was based solely, its sole argument being on that one image. And I'm thinking, hang on, there's all this other evidence for life on Mars, microbes in the 70s, trees in the 90s. Now, you know, potential insect, animal life, basically from Phoenix. Why is he focusing solely on this Bigfoot image, this Sasquatch in the deserts of Mars? It made no sense to me. I read his article, and he claims that he's seeing all sorts of objects which I just can't see in the images. And it's fair enough. Maybe not everyone's capable of. You know, I'm not discrediting him for that. But at one point, he's actually saying you can see something he calls a land octopus, and I think this is ridiculous. Even if there was such a thing, this image doesn't prove it. The same person, though, the problem is the same guy is in the exopolitics community and being promoted in the exopolitics community as a disclosure witness, claiming he's a witness to teleportation technology within. I don't know if it's a DOD or anything, but in the US establishment.
He says they've got time machines and things like that.
I'm putting the pieces together here, and I'm thinking, this guy, maybe he believes what he's saying. He's a lawyer, so, you know, who knows. But maybe he believes what he's saying. But the problem is, the way he's approached that analysis just discredits his arguments completely. But the problem is it rubs off on everybody else. And that's an issue.
If he's a lawyer, he must be telling the truth. And some other photographs before we finish. We've got this image here, which is, Bob Dean's. Bob Dean has spoken about this in some of his talks. Which on that image, it does look like it's some kind of man-made structure, or he claims it could be a spaceport.
Yeah, Bob Dean promotes this as he promotes this as being as evidence for like a base on Mars. He calls it the Mars base, I think, in his presentation at Barcelona's conference last year. There's a researcher called David Childress, who wrote a book called Extraterrestrial Archaeology. I think he was I think it came out in 1994. He referred to it as the airport terminal. He'd seen the same image. So Bob Dean has picked up an existing image. Bob Dean's chosen it because he claims to be aware of what is. He claims that there's a space program which has got a colony
on Mars.
And he's picked this image out to say that, look, this is the airport. This is like, it looks like it could be one. He's claiming it is the base, but to me, I wasn't sure. So what I dug out the original image, which was taken by Mariner 9 actually in 1972. Dug out the original image, and I basically, the original image as you see on this collation, you've got three versions. Top left is the original Mariner image, and it's such a low kind of
low
contrast. It's difficult to see anything. NASA themselves in the middle image I'll show you the contrast. You adapt it so you can actually see some detail. Now I've taken this to the extreme. I took the middle image. Well, actually, I took the first image, the original photo, and adjusted the contrast myself. And what I found was that when you get to where NASA's middle one image was, you see kind of curvature, and because it looks like an optical illusion, you can't see whether it's concave into the ground or convex over the planet. We can't see whether it's something above the surface or under. But anyway, you go on to change the contrast even further. What happens? The lighter parts obviously turn white, and then all the surrounding grey area starts turning white, and it gives an artificial square structure, square illusion to the image. So if you tweak the contrast too much, it just makes it look square and rectilinear, which the original image never was. So I think, I'm not discrediting Bob Dean and what he does. I don't know his sources and background, but I think he's picked an image here to argue his case, which is, it should have, you know, it's not quite the image he's portraying.
Yeah, I mean,
but I mean,
it may be something, but the image that he's used is far more convincing than the original image. So he should have used both of them in his.
Yeah, he used other images as well, and some of them actually I didn't really see what he saw in some of them as well.
Right.
I get the impression that there are some whistleblowers such as himself who are aware of stuff through word of mouth and in the intelligence community, to want of a better word, and he's trying to piece pieces together from stuff that's in the public domain.
Yeah.
And sometimes he does a good job, sometimes he comes up with something less.
And there are many whistleblowers, aren't there? Who Gary McKinnon is not a whistleblower. I guess he is a whistleblower.
He is in a sense, isn't he?
He is in a sense. Who claim that the Americans have these undisclosed ships in space that have been to Mars, and Mars they've got bases there. There are many people who theorise that there are people already in Mars. I've got one of the I think it was the rovers, Spirit and Opportunity. One of them in 2005 I think stopped working because it had sand on its solar panels, and basically the batteries went flat. And John Lear claims that the reason why it suddenly started working again is because one of these people who lives on Mars actually went out with a duster and cleaned the solar panel, and then it then charged the batteries up when it sprung back into life. So
yeah.
I thought that was quite funny.
It's interesting because I remember, I don't know if it's the same incident, but the incident of the rover losing its power. But there's a period around that time, 2006 I thought it was, one of the rovers basically was running at reduced power, say about 40%, and miraculously overnight it went back up to like 90% or something. So the problem was it was collecting dust on its solar panels, and something, like you say, something cleaned it. Well, Richard Hoagland has mentioned this on Coast to Coast Radio. Actually, mentioned that an image was taken, photographs taken directly after that event, which showed on the ground. You basically see what it looks like rainwater. It looks like the ground's wet, like it's been raining, and it's been postulated by some people that this is evidence for, basically rainwater raining on Mars, which was what people claim has cleaned the back of the.
Either that or
lens.
the man with the duster had a bucket as well with water in it.
Yeah, I think there are some people, some researchers who. It might be that there is a Mars colony. I don't know. I couldn't say either way. But if you're going to prove to people that there's a Mars colony,
you've got to
actually prove to people. You can't just. It does that statement from John Lear. As much as I expect something like that from John Lear, it doesn't prove anything to me. So.
Okay, and we're going to be talking about this and many other ufological subjects, aren't we?
We are,
at the Exopolitics Conference.
Yeah, the Leeds Exopolitics Conference, 2010.
Leeds Exopolitics Conference 2010, and that is, what are the dates, Anthony?
It's Saturday and Sunday, but August 7th and 8th.
Okay, and they can find out about that on the internet, and the URL is
www.exopolitics-leeds.co.uk.
And we've got 10 speakers there?
We've actually got 11 actually. We've got a special event which is Professor John Searle and a film showing a film about John Searle. Right. So we've got 10 speakers and a special event with John.
And Anthony's going to be talking about
Mars.
I'm going to be talking about the information war, and we've got Andrew Johnson, Nick Pope,
that's right. Mary Rodwell,
Richard Dolan.
Yes, right. Steve
Bassett.
And Alan Foster and Gary Heseltine, the policeman from Leeds, who runs the Prufos police database.
Yeah. Have we missed anyone?
David Griffin.
David Griffin.
I couldn't forget David.
Sorry, David. Right. Yeah. So get yourself there, because that's a lot of if you're interested in the UFO subjects and exopolitics, it's going to be a fantastic event, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a much bigger event than last year. Last year we had a trial run. It was like a one-day event, but we've actually gone to make the full conference this year. It's the only platform for exopolitics in the UK, and I think I don't actually know if they're doing a Barcelona conference this year, so it may well be the only one in Europe as far as I know.
Right.
I know Steve Bassett's on tour and doing various locations, but unless there is a Barcelona conference again this year, which I'm sure, it may well be the only one in Europe.
Okay then, Anthony, well, thanks very much indeed for coming on board, and hopefully we'll learn some more from you at the conference, because I'm just really sort of a novice when it comes to Mars. My knowledge is I'm a novice basically, but thanks very much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me. Thanks, Richard.
Okay, and we'll get you beamed back down to planet Earth.
Thank you.
And it just remains for me to say, keep your eyes on the skies, your feet on the ground, and tell all your friends about this show.
The Rich Planet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
You know, as the 1950s approached, we entered the space race, and serious scientists started thinking there could be life on this planet. So I believe there are certain institutes which sort of considered the possibility that there might be intelligent life even on Mars.
Well, yeah, well, NASA itself commissioned the Brookings Institute to look into it actually commissioned it to look into the peaceful. It's a study into the peaceful space exploration, but part of that was basically trying to consider what would happen if we discovered such things as intelligent beings outside of the solar system and outside of planet Earth. Sorry. The
Brookings Institute, was this sort of philosophers of the day, or what sort of people were involved in that?
Well, it was a think tank. It's basically a Washington DC based think tank that was basically, they'll do commissions, they'll do reports into all sorts of different things. And basically, NASA was founded in about 1958 or 59. At the same time, it's about around the same year NASA commissioned this report because, okay, they knew the Soviets had got some man in orbit. The Sputnik had been the first artificial satellite, and the Americans were a little bit far behind. So they needed to really get their act together to get on target in the space race. So the Brookings report was basically them giving them an overview of how they would proceed and conduct their space activities peacefully.
So they weren't really a technical body. They were more of like looking at the morality of it and the impact on humanity.
Oh, yeah, and the economic impact as well.
Yeah, and I believe we've got a quote here from the Brookings Institute, Anthony.
Yeah, I'll just read this short section out. It goes, though intelligent or semi-intelligent life conceivably exists elsewhere in the solar system, if intelligent extraterrestrial life is discovered in the next 20 years, it will very probably be by radio telescope from other solar systems. However, evidence of its existence might also be found in artifacts left on the moon or other planets. So what NASA's the think tank came up with the conclusion was that if extraterrestrial life exists and it's out there, then we might start seeing the remnants of that when we start exploring into the solar system. And that was the whole reason for NASA commissioning it. The report itself covered all sorts of things like the advances in weather forecasting technology, so they could see they knew that they could actually work across over the plains, the lighter plains. You can see there's actually darker regions and light regions, and these lines intersect over the light regions. Schiaparelli was an Italian. He referred to these as canali because that's the Italian word which means channel. Okay. It was mistranslated into the English word canal, right? And so, which obviously has connotations because it means it's synthetic. Somebody's built it. It's not a natural form. And so, what you had by the end of the 19th century, you had astronomers such as Percival Lowell, an American businessman and entrepreneur, I guess. He built the Lowell Observatory in Flagstaff. It was the first time an observatory had been built dedicated to, well, in a certain location which had optimum viewing conditions, so you could see more information. And Lowell basically looked at he looked through on a telescope at Mars. He saw the same canals as he recalled them, which were actually just channels by Schiaparelli's reckoning. And he basically created a mythology about the existence of Martian beings living on basically this world, and who were using these channels to transport water from the polar regions, which he considered to have water, down to the desert regions, which he considered to be dry. So basically, Percival Lowell created. Well, he wasn't the first person to postulate the idea of Martian beings, but he really kind of promoted the idea in the popular culture at the time. Okay,
and what are these channels or these lines? I mean, do we know what they are now?
In fact, we don't really know what they are to this day, because once we got there in the first mission, which is Marion 9, there was no channels canali to be seen. Okay. So we're not really sure what they were looking at. Right. It's been speculated. Well, there's a scientist from about 1920s whose name I forget, but he speculated that what these channels was actually the radial impact debris fields. So imagine like a meteorite hits, you get radial patterns out. So there's something what he was saying was that the dark spots between the canals were impact craters. Obviously, from Earth-based telescopes in the 19th century, they're not going to see that detail. But we never really worked out because the coloration of the surface seems to have been different when we got there in the 60s and
we'll
70s.
Come on to colours later on in the programme.
Yeah.
Now, so it was Hoagland that first got you involved.
Yeah, he got me hooked.
He's certainly a character, isn't he?
He is.
Now, there's been interest in Mars for centuries, hasn't there? And it sort of became more scientific in the 50s. But tell us about telescopes and people's interest in general over the centuries?
The telescope was invented in the 1600s, and it was, we don't really know who invented the telescope. It was invented by a Dutchman, apparently, of all accounts. There's a Dutchman applied for a patent, but it was refused because he hadn't actually invented it, because it had been widely known. The technology worked its way to Italy and to Venice, and Galileo basically started producing them for the market, started selling them. And it was actually in the same year of 1608 that Galileo first reported that he'd actually looked at Mars through the telescope, and that began the first real exploration of Mars. And as the years went by, even Cassini and all the kind of famous astronomers would have looked at Mars, Cassini, Huygens, and it got to towards like the middle of the 18th century. The telescopes were significantly advanced, that you could see kind of more detail. They'd also started using one of Newton's ideas, which is spectroscopy, to work out what the chemical composition of the Mars's atmosphere was. So by the middle of the 19th century, they'd already deduced that it had an atmosphere, that it was similar in some regards to the Earth, and that it possibly contained water vapour. There's debate about the accuracy of the scientific method at that time, so it wasn't, you know, people argued the case. But what happened was in the East, the opposition of 1977, opposition is when the Earth and Mars get to the closest point. It happens approximately every 2 years. And in 1877, Giovanni Schiaparelli, who was an astronomer based in Italy, looked at Mars through his telescope, one of his high-powered telescopes at the time, and started detailing lots of the features of
right. And what year are you talking about here?
This is 1877.
1877, and we've got an image there. Is that one of his images?
Yeah, this image is one of his maps. They called them Schiaparelli's maps, and people had drawn diagrams before, but Schiaparelli made a really detailed documentation of what he saw on the planet's surface. And it's basically one of the most noteworthy features is basically these long linear lines that kind of intersect. And
the RichPlanet Starship is sponsored by Geared4.com online bikes, clothing and accessories.
Welcome on board the RichPlanet Starship, broadcasting from somewhere high above the Earth. I'm Richard D. Hall, and this week's guest is a scientist who has been looking at evidence for the existence of life on Mars. Since Galileo first developed his telescope in 1608 and was first to observe Mars through it, astronomers have wondered about the possibility of life on the red planet. So without further ado, let's activate the teleporter and get him beamed up onto the ship. It's Anthony Beckett.
Hi Richard, how are you?
Welcome Anthony.
Thank you.
Are you okay?
Very well, thanks, yeah.
Good. So we're here to talk about Mars
Yes,
and your passion, I guess.
it's become that, yeah.
Now, how did you first get interested in Mars? Because I know you have a scientific background, you've got degrees in chemistry. How did that lead to an interest in Mars?
Well, I've always been following the space programs, and around 2004, I went to a conference and I saw a guy called Richard Hoagland give a presentation about evidence of artificial structures on Mars. And I came home from, this is 2004, 6 years ago, I came home and I just started studying and looking into this thing.
Right.
And what I found with it, there was very compelling evidence that there was something about this data, but I found it was quite difficult information to present to people, so I took it upon myself to start to do that myself, to put together the information in a digestible form that people could relate to. Out to see. Back in the days, they had like a few hours warning for a hurricane coming over Florida, for example. It gave them the opportunity to realise that they could develop weather systems and things, all sorts of different things. But this was only minor. So this part about the intelligent life was only a minor part of the report, but it might be well be a significant one.
Right. Well, we'll come on to the possibility of ruins and other such things later on. But I've got a list here, Anthony, which is I didn't realise there's been so many probes actually gone to Mars or attempted to go to Mars. I mean, you've got a list here which goes right back to 1960. And it's interesting that the first sort of 5 missions were all Russian up to 1962, and every single one of them failed. And then we've got Mariner 3, which was the first US one, which failed. And then the first successful one was Mariner 4 in 1964, and that returned just 21 images.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a flyby. The Mariner 4 mission was a flyby. It didn't go into orbit, and it only took a limited number of pictures. So the 21 images was simply because it was it was passing Mars, and it just shot the video cameras to see what it could see. And to be frank, it kind of was kind of disappointing, because prior to that mission, it was widely, even scientists seriously considered that there might well be, like, higher forms of life on Mars, such as trees and things. And in the early days of NASA, they were actually considering how they would actually detect life on other planets and this kind of thing. And they actually considered that when looking for life on Mars, they might even see evidence of plant life in videos shot of the planet. Unfortunately, Mariner was, being of the day and the technology of the day, it was black and white video. It wasn't very high resolution. It basically wasn't going to show evidence of life. But the disappointing part of this was that it showed evidence of heavy cratering on Mars, which basically made the planet look very much more like the Moon, which we know to be lifeless.
Right.
So it was disappointing in that respect, because it dashed the hopes of many who thought there might be life on Mars.
Right, with just 21 images.
Yeah.
And if we look, I mean, there's more than 40 probes actually gone to Mars over the years, and they're nearly all either American or Russian. And out of the 40 odd, there's only 17, give or take 1 or 2. I've just done an estimate here, 17 out of 41